Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rosie. Hi, Tara.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see you on what is the end of a very, very beautiful day, right? Have you enjoyed the sunshine? It's been incredible. And I haven't been in London for quite a while, and seeing everybody out and about has just put me exactly in the right mood. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to ask Tara. So if you haven't read the book yet, it starts off just like you immediately gripped. And in the introduction, you pose this really powerful question, which really resonated with me. And you say, what's a real identity and who gets to define it? And I just thought, for me, this question, I could feel your power. I could really feel how strong you are and how there's a personal story there. And I wonder whether you can share with us a little bit what that story is and how you found and defined your identity and you found your voice.
Thank you. Well, you jumped right into it. Well, first of all, it's so wonderful to be here, and I look forward to the conversation, but also hearing from you. Just a bit of a background about the book for those who may not know, and Brita, I would love if you can also say a few sentences about the book for those of you who may have not yet read the book. Our stories are very different, but I think there's so much similarities in the both of them, and I think that's what really underscores the power of storytelling, which we're going to talk about. But for those of you who may not know about my book, I wrote The Heartbeat of Iran over the span of about 3.5 years. The book came out in June of last year, and you, Brita, are way more brave than I am, because Brita's book came out last January, still in the middle of lockdown. So congratulations to you. Your job was way harder. The Heartbeat of Iran is a collection of 24 incredibly intimate stories of ordinary Iranians from different walks of life. The north, the south, left, right, incredibly different backgrounds, ways of thinking, principles, and so on, in a country of 80 million that unfortunately to so much of the world, the rest of the world, is only seen through this very narrow prism of politics. If we turn on the news, probably the first or second thing we hear about Iran is the nuclear program or whatever rogue behavior that the government is engaged in, right? And in all my travels in storytelling and career as a journalist, I always try to focus on people, because I think that's where the heart of the story is. And I often say in all my talks that Iran is a country of 80 million human beings rather than 80 million nuclear heads. And there's a distinction in that unfortunately we fail to see through news headlines and news packages that are on air. And I come from a sort of mainstream news background. I worked for different American news networks and channels, and as an immigrant, someone who grew up in Iran and lived there until my late teens, but also as an American journalist, I always struggled to connect my American counterparts to the human sides and the human stories that I grew up with, right? And to answer your question, Brita, this is why I chose to write this book. Telling the human voices, again, has always been at the core of my journalism career and storytelling. Obviously, when you're doing breaking news, it's so hard to do that. But I really wanted to take time and work on a country that I know best, perhaps, and that is my own. And tell the stories of its ordinary people to the rest of the world. And we can talk about the individual stories. And again, I always say beforehand, for folks who've not read the book, these are not rosy pictures. These are not, this is not a romantic take on Iran. This is not to sort of stereotype it and say, oh, these are the beautiful things about this culture. No, not at all. But rather, allow my readers outside of Iran to see the nuances and colors and sort of, the humanity that's at stake. And again, this resonates so much with your work because you come from, humanitarian background where you spend, almost 2 decades working on women's issues worldwide, and we're going to talk about that. But again, at its core, it's about people. And I truly don't think there's anything more powerful than ordinary people and what they do in their own communities and beyond.
And so in terms of your own personal voice, and how did you find that? Because you obviously, you say you're straddling two nationalities and identities, and so how your own, a little bit about you
as a me, person. Okay. I mean, listen, when I moved to the States, I was 16 years old, and you know, prior to that, my family was always back and forth between the U.S. and Iran, and you know, my father was a physician. My parents were educated in the U.S. in the 60s, so you know, I don't have the story of the sort of classic story of sort of one day I left and you know, I began my life in a new country, but rather for me it was about finding the sweet spot between the dualities, right? I mean, I'm as Iranian as I'm American, and you know, the irony of it all, which is so ridiculous, is that I can't even go to Iran because of my work as an American journalist, which is ridiculous, right? But I have the ability to distinguish between the people of that country and the government. And I think as a teenager, I always found myself explaining my identity to people. You know, my American high school friends would come to me and ask, oh, you know, where'd you come from? What did you wear that black veil? I mean, you know, these very silly stereotypes. And at first, you know, it was daunting, and then it became funny, and then it became annoying. And I realized that the point of reference that my American friends and colleagues and, you know, counterparts have to what an Iranian person is very black and white, right? And it was frustrating. And then, you know, I struggled so hard to break into this mainstream American news world, right? Because, you know, I'm Iranian, I'm from the Middle East. Sure, I may not have an accent, but that was so gosh darn to, you know, get rid of my Iranian accent. It was not easy. And I was cognizant of that. So then I became that, right? But then I didn't want to give up my heritage and identity. And so it's not easy. And, you know, and now I live in London, and I'm an immigrant, right? And I may not say the right thing, and I'm not at home. But then now at 35, I've learned that it's okay. It's okay not to belong, because what does that even mean, right? Because I realize that we belong, and I belong no matter where I am, because I'm anchored, yeah? And so I think my work grew out of this constant need to define and explain my identity, but that journey made me anchored in the knowledge that doesn't matter where I am. You know, I belong, you belong. It doesn't matter where you go, you know, what company you work for, what city you live in. You should be defined by you yourself, not, you know, where you come from.
Yay!
Yes.
Oh my God, that speaks right to my heart. Absolutely. And can I just jump in? Because,
yes, please.
Because I think
yes.
it's so beautiful. Actually, in my book Face to Face, which is it says it's a guide to owning a woman's guide to owning her power. And by the way, for the men in the audience, I actually had a conversation with my publisher, and I said, I'm not comfortable with saying a woman's guide to owning her power, because I really want it just to be a guide to owning your power. And she's like, yeah, but you know, because obviously they have the marketing hat on, right? And they're like, no, but you know, your audience is predominantly women, and you've always worked for women, and so, you know, we really need to call it a women's guide on. And so I kind of, you know, I said, okay, fine, let's do it. But when I was writing it, I was very aware that obviously I am a woman, and I've lived my life as a woman, and a lot of the experience is shaped through that lens. But I've made sure that the tips and ideas in the book are applicable to anyone. because it's about owning your power and the idea that the power is within you. And I think that links, for me, it links to your point around belonging. And actually, I talk about belonging and this idea as I was reflecting on it, because also I'm German and I moved to Venezuela when I was 15, which really shaped my life. And I talk about that in my book. And now I live in the UK and I'm married to a Spaniard and my daughters have just moved to Germany. And, you know, so right. And so as I was reflecting on belonging, I had this inspiration. I thought, oh, actually, belonging is maybe the longing to be. To really be who you are in your essence, and know that that's enough, and that it's not anchored in any identity that we attach to, whether that's nationality, ethnicity, or a role, whether that's a mother or a wife or a father or a son, but it's about being the essence that you are and allowing yourself to really shine your light into the world and find your purpose, right? So purpose, and I know we were talking about this earlier, purpose is a really big part of my book, and I guide the reader through how you can find and define your own purpose. And that was a really groundbreaking exercise for me, because it enabled me to let go of this belief that I'm only worthy if I do, if I achieve. So you know, being the executive director or having a master's in blah, 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 or, right, all these kind of accolades that obviously our society often tells us, you know, once you've done this, then, you know, then you will have gotten to wherever it is that you are supposed to get to somehow, you know, I mean, and, but actually the fact obviously is that you arrive there and then it's still not enough. And then you set your sight to the next one and then you're still not enough. So this not enoughness, like, am I good enough? It just accompanies you as long as you determine your worth through external values, accolades, whatever. Purpose, defining your purpose, allows you to shift the focus on who you are, on what matters to you, and how you want to matter in the world. And you can decide that. And obviously the job can be a way in which you achieve that, but it doesn't have to be. And I thought, and that was really important for me to spend some time sharing that. And I see it's a huge part of stepping into your power. It's freeing yourself up and defining. You get to be in the driver's seat, right? You're not waiting for somebody else to tell you, oh yeah, you're good enough now. Okay, good, yeah, good to go now. You decide that right now you are already everything that you need to be, and you can decide how you want to impact the world.
And I think so much of that, you know, Brita and I come from, you know, very different backgrounds, but very parallel trajectories in a sense that our work on global issues, whether in the humanitarian space or myself as a journalist, allows you to see the impact of narratives. And I think as you were speaking, I just want to share this with our guests today, and that is, in tandem to finding your purpose, you know, no matter where you are, what stage of life you're in, I think, and this is from my own experience, it's also important to understand the power of narrative. You know, the narratives that exist around us, the narratives that dominate whatever conversation it is, whether it's women's issues, whether, you know, it's a certain political conversation on a particular country, and changing those narratives and changing the culture of that conversation. And I say this because, you know, similar to, you know, what your publishers told you, my publishers are in New York, and you know, interesting, yeah. It's very different. But talking about this sort of purpose and narrative is, you know, for me, so my last network job was with Al Jazeera America, and that was in 2016. Prior to that, I was at CNN and CNN International. But 2016, as many of you know, it was election year in the United States, and, you know, a certain somebody got to the White House, and I cover foreign affairs and international issues. And so I knew that I don't want to be in the network world. I don't want to be in mainstream news. So I went to the think tank route, you know, started my nonprofit, which we'll talk about, but then decided to write this book because it was time to sort of work on changing the narrative on what I thought is needed to be added on the Iran discussion, which completely lacks the human stories. But to your point, I remember so many agents and publishers that I was in touch with, or those who would reach out to me, they wanted me to write the sort of typical stereotype story of, oh, I escaped the revolution, or I, tell the woman behind the veil story, or that sort of sexy, woman who escaped, a awful life in Iran kind of thing. Or also they wanted me to write, about refugees. But I was very cognizant that, what's my story? What is it that I know that I can tell in order to advance something, or in order to introduce an alternative narrative to what's out there. So I just wanted to add this, because whether it's the conversation about women empowerment, which we're going to talk about, or whatever political box is it that we're discussing, I think in addition to finding your purpose, it's also important to know how we can advance the narrative and change the culture and shift the conversation on whatever it is that we don't like. But I'm going to stop there, but I wanted to just add that to the point that you made.
Yeah, actually, maybe I can come in now on the stories, because that was one of the things when I was reading the book. So in my book, I decided also to share some stories of the women that I've met throughout the years working with Women for Women International in countries affected by conflict. Because
I'm so sorry, Brita, but would you mind telling our audience about Women for Women International? I'm very familiar with the organization. I had the privilege of knowing the founder and so on. But would you briefly tell our audience about
Yeah. It's an organization that works in countries affected by conflict, and it helps women who live in those countries to thrive and rebuild their lives after conflict, in a nutshell. And it's countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Rwanda, Congo, etc. And it's been a huge privilege to work with that organization for nearly 13 years, up until very recently, and to meet many women and to witness their immense strength and resilience and how they never give up hope. So I loved Rosie asking, what are you hopeful about? It's such an important question, and I've seen women in some of the most horrendous circumstances not lose hope. And that's very, very powerful. And Women for Women International invests in that hope. And so it was really important for me to tell those stories as a way of showing the immense strength that resides within us as human beings, but also the inspiration that I had drawn from that, and the way we're connected. And we'll talk about this in a moment. But for you, Tara, when I read your book, I got really excited, because there are many stories of really powerful, inspirational women in here, right? And in fact, we have a female diver and a Paralympic champion, and Iran's first female race car driver, and all of those stories of the women, what they have in common for me is definitely real challenges because of the kind of societal environment and the discrimination that women have experienced significantly and continue to experience. And you talk about really challenging issues like child marriage, forced marriage, and what you achieve so well for me is, as you say, this very human way of telling the story that really brings you, as if you're sitting next to her. That's how it feels, and you're feeling the pain and the sorrow and the immense struggle that they've gone through, and you feel the power, right? This incredible power. And I just wonder whether you can talk a little bit about it. Felt really deliberate. And they felt like a really strong, if I may say so, feminist message coming through. Would you call yourself a feminist? And how does that, sit with your, with your dual nationality? And also, what sort of feedback have you received when the book came out? Yeah.
Oh wow, thank you. It's very kind of you to see all those layers, because that's really what I try to do. I mean, the book is, through the collection of these stories, the 24 stories, There are layers and layers and layers of history and social issues and political issues and nuance and nuance and nuance. And this is something I talk about so much, nuance and context. Contextualizing an issue is so important in order to justly tell that story to your audience. And again, in the news world, you don't have that opportunity. You know, you have a minute to tell a very important story, or you have 800 words to tell something so profound, but how do you do that? How do you contextualize? How do you capture nuances? And, you know, I could never do this book on Venezuela. I can never do this book, you know, on probably the rest of the world. Maybe on the US I can, because my theory is that, you know, you need to live and breathe the society that you're telling your audience about. And for me, I could do that about Iran because I knew the isms, you know, I knew all of those colors, the different shades that exist in one's life, but also the society at large, and therefore contextualizing it. So what you saw, I'm glad you saw, but yes, it was deliberate. I'm feminist, I don't even know what the right answer to that is, but I believe in probably almost all values of feminism, but I also believe that we cannot exclude the men. You know, I like to see a world where we're all feminists and we all work together, and there's no need to be a feminist or not, you know, fight for these notions, rather than it's an all-inclusive society where all values are shared equally, right? But yes, I wanted to talk about these issues. But Brita, I want to just sort of touch on a bigger point, and then we're going to talk about the woman, because I want to talk about the stories of women in your book. But one of the things, it's okay, that happens all the time in live TV. No, really, it's okay. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Is empathy. You know, one of my, I guess, my main goal with The Heartbeat of Iran was to allow my audience in the United States and sort of the Western world to understand how much more they have in common with an average Iranian who otherwise they may know nothing about, okay? Some stories are hopeful, some stories are very sad. You know, you have religious folks, you have conservative people in the book, you know, you have liberals, you know, different walks of life, as is in any society. But the goal really was to create this understanding that you know, young women, young men living in the United States or, you know, United Kingdom, perhaps have a little bit more in common with this average Iranian that you may know nothing about. But it's up to you to decide, and it's up to you to understand what those similarities are, and understand the importance of seeing people beyond the status quo, beyond the stereotype, and therefore allow yourself to create empathy. And that's the word I wanted to get to, empathy. Something that I think we lack so much in our sort of global conversation and global community. And as a journalist, I've seen that so much. You know, for example, for a month, the headlines are about Afghanistan. You know, for the next probably 2 months, it's Ukraine. You know, then is another big story. But then people forget, right? Sure, news headlines dwindle, but in our daily life, we can keep that empathy alive and care and show our support, therefore, through our action. But I believe the only way that we can care about people from, you know, the rest of the world and other communities is if we have empathy, if we know the common grounds, and if we know what we share with those people. So the more we know about the commonalities that we have with the people of other countries, the more we're empathetic, and therefore the more we care. And really that was the goal with these stories, especially with the women, is that, you know, I wanted to break away from these dominant victim mentality of Iranian women. Yes, you know, the government is utterly oppressive. Yes, it's a dictatorship. Yes, you know, there's so many daily challenges, you know, from challenges at home to societal challenges to, you know, lack of rule of law that women face in Iran. But life goes on. How does it? What's that journey? What's the story of resilience that these women can share, and what do they have in common with the rest of the world. So if we see, and touch the common grounds, that's, I think, an opportunity for us to make progress and peace and move forward in whatever sort of mission we have as a global community.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much. Empathy is such an important word, and what comes to me, and this is something that I'm really passionate about. We can't think another person. I mean, we can try, but if I think another person, I don't feel her or him. Right, so empathy is feeling with, right, or feeling the other person. And so and I've actually been talking about this recently in the context of Russia and the Ukraine, and the desperation that I think so many of us feel, and this deep pain that we're feeling, and this desire that immediately after that comes, in me at least, like, I need to do something. I have to do something, and I think that we often shy away from staying with the feeling because it's so painful or it's so difficult. But it's actually staying with the feeling that will give way to the healing. And so this notion that I can feel you, and because I can feel you, I might not speak your language, I might never, but I can feel you if I allow myself to open my heart. But it's not going to be in the head, right? And this is the thing, that we think people, and we stay here because that's what we've been trained to do, and we analyze, and we've got the facts, we've got all the facts, but we're not stopping for a moment to feel what it feels like to live in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and to know that your sister's been raped and that your children have been killed, but if we do, and I know it's painful, but if we do, something shifts in us. And that's what I've seen in the work, and some of our wonderful supporters from Women for Women International are here. That's what we do with Women for Women International. That's what we've always done. We have told the stories, yes, but we've invited to feel. Allow yourself to feel. Because yes, it's painful, but when you allow that, your heart opens, and then you can also feel that there is something that you can be for another person. So in the case of Women for Women International, it's through sponsorship. You can sponsor a woman, you can write letters to her, you can say to her, I see you. I believe in you.
I just love that you're saying that, that is so powerful. And part of the questions that we want to ask is the power of storytelling. And you nail that, because in all the talks I've done over and over, I think about this beautiful quote from Kazuo Ishiguro, the Nobel laureate in literature. In his acceptance speech, he says something so profound, yet so simple, and that is, storytelling at its core is about someone else telling another, this is how I feel. This is what I see. Do you feel that? Do you see that? And I think, that's why I chose this medium, to tell the stories that I wanted to tell from this sort of mysterious part of the world to my Western audience. And similarly, what you're trying to do with the stories that you're capturing, talking about this very specific notion of women empowerment rather than empowerment. And that's what I want to kind of shift the conversation to and ask you. But I talked a little bit about my personal journey and my personal life. Brita, you mentioned that you grew up in Venezuela, starting when you were 15. Can you tell our audience about how your sort of global upbringing helps you be more empathetic and therefore see the things that you see and carry within your work? What was the power in that sort of global life trajectory that you had?
Yeah. I mean, the moment of moving to Venezuela from Germany at the age of 14, just turning 15, was deeply life-changing, right? I mean, I'd never been to a country affected by extreme poverty, and I had never seen it and witnessed it with my own eyes. And seeing that really shocked me and shook me to the core, and ignited what I call my fierce, right? This is why my book is called Fierce to Fierce, because I really felt my fierce and my outrage and I wanted to literally grab people and shake them and say, hello, did you see what I see? Like, this is not okay. Like, how is this possible? How can we have such unbelievable inequality where, there's so much wealth and richness, and then at the same time you have extreme poverty. And I just, I was 15, but this kind of 15-year-old outrage still lives in me, and it's alive and kicking. And I think it's a healthy outrage, right? Because you feel something that is definitely not right. And for me, there were two key things. 15 is a key age as a human being. You're really waking up to your gender identity, to like who you are, outside your family. And at the same time, I was witnessing gender inequality. So I was witnessing my own, because I have a younger brother, and I was really waking up to how my parents treated my brother quite differently to me. And at the same time, I was seeing women in Venezuela being disproportionately affected by poverty, and fending for themselves and looking after children by themselves, and that really, and I think maybe this is what it was, right? I experienced it myself in my own life, and I saw it playing out in a society that was extremely affected by poverty. And so I just saw more similarities than differences, and that then became absolutely a big mission of mine, to create these connections, because the more we separate ourselves, from within ourselves, right? So I separated, I tried to suppress my fierceness, because I thought that wasn't going to be accepted, rightly so, by the way. Right, so then you separate yourself, then you separate yourself from others. You think you're different to the others, and then the next thing you separate humanity from the planet. And so my mission became to create connection within me, to become whole, connection between people, to build bridges, and connecting with the world.
And that's something that we talked about, which is, again, respectively within our different sort of works. It wasn't about stereotyping or creating the others.
No, exactly.
Tell us about that, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll share my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no,
pertaining the stories that you mentioned, by the way, about the woman. But we talked about that. Why don't you sort of expand on that?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we were just saying that we both obviously we're telling stories that are not our stories, right? They're stories of women we've met. But I felt that you really found a way to tell those stories without othering a person, and this goes back to your multidimensional way of portraying the people. So yeah, maybe it would be nice to hear more about that.
Exactly. And I think you do the same, and you do as well. But for the stories in the book, again, I just want to underscore this need to understand the many layers that exist in each individual's life, and how much more we have in common than what we see and what we're told. And the second part is very important to me, because we're all consumers, right? We're consumers of information. We're consumers of news. The knowledge that we have is told to us by someone else or something else, or by way of our own research. And I think it's so important to be able to understand the many colors that exist within all the information that we've consumed. And for me, it was profoundly important to move beyond the stereotypes that exist on these women in Iran, and introduce the many, many, many layers. So that again goes to this notion of not creating the others, but rather an opportunity for the rest of the world, to perhaps have an opportunity to connect with these folks in Iran.
Actually, Tara, maybe you referred to your humanitarian work earlier. I would really love to know, because I think this is another way in which you're building bridges, right, and creating connections. So maybe, and also I'm just aware of the time. Yeah, good. I just want to make sure that we leave some time for any questions or comments from you as well. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and then
yes, of course. So I started. Since 2014, that was sort of the height of ISIS activities and brutalities, especially in Syria and Iraq. 2014, Mosul fell, and perhaps ISIS was as its strongest, up until, late 2015. And I spent a lot of time covering the Syrian refugee crisis and the Iraqi refugee crisis in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And, I spent a lot of time in the field. My focus has always been international issues and foreign affairs, but also humanitarian issues at large. And so in every single story that I did on this, conflict, whether it was in Syria or Iraq or, the humanitarian crises in the region, and also the challenges of the host communities, I couldn't help but to see the tremendous need for mental health and psychosocial and emotional support for, whether it be the vulnerable host communities or the refugees or the IDPs, the internally displaced people. And so, whether it was a story on education, the politics of the host community, whatever it was, Brita, I just couldn't help but to feel and see the psychological wounds that these folks were facing, right? And I'm happy to talk about this, but for me, there's a just major distinction between journalism and activism. I'm not an activist. I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller, I'm a reporter, but there are certain things that you cannot not care about. That there's no right or wrong. Nobody can argue that, child trafficking, you have to be objective about child trafficking. Child trafficking is wrong. This is, want it or not, it's wrong. Seeing a child suffer from PTSD and trauma, that's wrong. So it took me some time to understand what role I can play within this space that I worked in and seen. Because again, in your work as a humanitarian, for me, I don't think there's anything more humbling than having someone else share their story with you, especially the most daunting of circumstances and events that have happened to them. It's utterly humbling and a privilege. And I couldn't, leave, the camps that I've spent in or, the field and come to New York and just like, okay, bye. And so I think that was sort of when I decided that, what hat do I wear? Do I continue wearing my journalist hat, or do I want to put sort of, an activist hat on this issue of mental health for children? And, I was born during the Iran-Iraq war. I was not affected by it whatsoever. I was very privileged. But had I been born into another family, into another city, into another part of Iran, I could have very well been a refugee or an IDP. And that was part of it. And the second part is that, grief and loss we all face. We all deal with it differently in our life. And I've dealt with grief, I've dealt with loss. And the idea that these children and these families don't have any opportunity to, number one, understand that it's okay that they're feeling this way, but number two, not have any resources for the entire life to deal with the tremendous psychological vulnerabilities that they're facing. And so, for me, I get very angry. I get very angry when things are not working. So, I tend to weaponize that anger into some sort of impact. And that's when I created Art of Hope in 2016 with the sole mission of addressing the mental health needs and psychosocial needs of vulnerable Syrian refugees in Lebanon. As you know, Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. I wish we could expand the work we do elsewhere, but we're a very small nonprofit. But that's what Art of Hope is. To date, we've done numerous programming in the field. And we're now actually in the middle of thinking how we can help the young, teenage and child refugees from Ukraine under the same mission of targeting the mental health needs of these refugees. Again, we're a small nonprofit, but I hope I answered your question as to how I pivoted into this humanitarian space from journalism.
Yeah, amazing. It's wonderful. It's so important what you're doing. Wonderful, really. Thank you.
I try.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, shall we, Rosie, is this a good time to ask for questions or any comments that you might have? Yes? And then there's another lady in the back as well.
Thank you very much for that. It was very interesting from all sorts of points of view. Sorry. One thing that did occur to me is how much attention do you pay in your stories of grief and suffering and need for help on Western interference in the Middle East, and especially now when we're looking at Yemen, we're looking at Palestine, and we're looking at, historically, Iran, also the 1979 revolution, America effected, and also Libya. Do we ever get that viewpoint in what's happening now in your wonderful stories, or is that just reduced to each person's experience?
That is such a great question, in a sense that you mentioned quite a few countries that in and of itself deserve a few books that would allow us to change the narrative and to shed light on the, again, many isms that we don't talk about. I so wish there were similar books on people's stories and the humanity that's at stake from Libya, from Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, a country that women, from Women International have worked tremendously in. I ask, in all my book talks, I encourage us to ask for those narratives, for those books, for those conversations, for those TV shows. I mean, right now, I'm speaking now as an American, the Arab American community, the Muslim American community is incredibly active within the media and television space. And that's just recently happening. And that's when we're going to see the introduction of these new stories and narratives that would tackle the many issues and isms that you, I think, want to see pertaining to these countries. With regards to my book, which is on Iran, I try to give you the many layers of the Western impact, the impact of the Western meddling in Iran, not just the last let's say 40 years or so, but prior to that. I try to give you not just a contemporary history, but the history of the last 100 years. I think the first story is the story of a grandmother in the book, and she passed when she was 93 years old. But I chose that story deliberately because in her story you get to go back 100 years ago, understand the constitutional revolution of Iran, live through 2 world wars from the perspective of one woman, go through this time when they forced women to not wear the veil, but then also live through the time when they were forced to put the veil back on, right? So I hope I give you more than the current history, but I would say that it's not a history book, but an incredibly contextualized book that would allow us to perhaps understand the socio-political and historic events of now and the past better. But yes, I want to see more stories that encompass all of these isms in all these countries. And I think, Brita, you do that in your book through the stories of these women, if we can say.
Yeah, no, I think you should definitely read a book, because I was really impressed, Tara, with how much I learned about Iran. And like you said, it's also like the ebb and flow of how politics shape a country and how leaders shape a country, and how much we as people are then subject to those changes and how that influences our lives. So, but there was somebody, yes, exactly.
Thank you. So Tara, I also have a question for you. So I come from a partly Kurdish background myself, and since you're writing about Iran, I mean, I'm just curious about, since you said context and nuance is very important for you, and that's what you were really trying to do in this book. Do you have voices from the Kurdish community? Do you have those perspectives, and maybe even like the Azeri community, for example? Do you have those angles in your book?
Well, thank you for being here, and thanks for your question. And yes, I do. And I try to. First of all, I have to say, by no means 24 stories are representative of, a country of 80 million, right? And I would not even pretend to have done justice to this very complex society and country. And I will say that, it took 4 years to complete this book, about 2.5 years. My husband is here, and he's very well aware of the daunting process of doing the interviews and listening to hours and hours and hours of conversations that I had with these folks, and then putting it into stories that my Western audience would understand, right? But I initially interviewed about 35 or 37 individuals, and we had to cut it down to 24 just for length, because otherwise I'm told nobody would buy this book because it would be so thick. And my stories were each twice the size of what you see here, but my New Yorker editor just chopped it up. So yes, I actually, there's a story of this incredible painter. I don't want to give away too much, but he's of Kurdish background. He's from Kermanshah, he's from Qasr Shirin. It's a border town with Iraq. It has an incredible history that dates back, to over, 1,000 years. And during the Iran-Iraq War, he takes us to the reed fields and how music has played such an important role in his childhood, and how later in his 40s, he realized that those reeds played such a tremendous role in his artwork, which essentially is a mixed medium between calligraphy and painting. And for those of you who don't know, reed, ney in Farsi, has such a profound meaning of lament, of mourning, right? And so there's a lot of poetry in his story, but I talk about the Kurdish community, the Azeri community, of course. My own grandmother, family were from Azerbaijan, so I do talk about that. So yes, I try to delve into the many sort of ethnic, language, religious minority. I mean, believe it or not, in the book we have a story of two Jewish Iranians, and again, by no means I want my audience, the readers won't because they'll see, but by no means the intention was to stereotype and say, oh, by the way, we have Jewish people in Iran. Oh, by the way, women go to school, and no. But the idea was to show you what life is for these people and allow you to sit with them, sit next to them. And so in the book, you have a fascinating story of a rabbi, and there's another chapter on this fabulous young female entrepreneur. And I actually didn't know about this. I wanted to profile her because she was in the fashion and accessories space, and she just was super fun and fabulous. And I realized she's Jewish. And it was just fantastic to tell, another story of a young Jewish woman in Iran. And also the challenges, that exist, and so on. And again, I want to, pardon, but I can go on and on about this, but Brita, I want to preface this with with the idea that these people are still living in Iran. Yeah, this is not a political book. I was very cognizant about the way I tell the stories, because I definitely, want to protect my sources. This was not a gotcha book. This is not about, making any political statements, but rather telling a human story through a very contextualized lens, right? So I also wanted to share that with you as well. Yes.
Amazing. Thank you, Tara. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
And Brita, I have one more question for you. I want to ask because, and I think it would play into, everything we're talking about, but I'm going to be respectful of other folks' questions.
Just a quick one. You talked about all the women that you met were hopeful. What do you do when people lose hope? Do you see a black and white? Do you see that distinction? Do you meet people who've lost hope? And do you feel there's anything that you can speak into that situation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's It's really interesting. I actually haven't met many people who are hopeless. And I think that's maybe because I meet them when the organization has already found them. And that process of, and with Women Forum International, there are teams in the countries who are from the country, and they go into the communities and they specifically look for women who have lost everything, who are on their own, and who need the support. And so I'm sure that they will have met women who are hopeless. I haven't, because when I meet them, they've already been seen. They've already been given a place where they can come and meet other women. And again, this is this connection that we've been talking about, just knowing that you're not alone, and this kind of notion of being felt. So our trainers, I remember, they would always, it was so inspired me so much, because they weren't just trainers, they loved every woman, you know, they felt every woman. And so is this notion again, you know, I feel you feeling me. So the women, they were able to heal their trauma, or in the process of healing their trauma, because they're no longer alone, because they are being recognized. And it's not, they haven't made this up. This is something that really happened, and there's kind of a validity that's given to what's happening, and in that process, actually, now that I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about it. I think that is the process that gives hope, right? That this, I feel you, and the reason why I'm coming up with this is because I'm now training as a trauma healer, so I'm in kind of intergenerational and collective trauma, which I think it was, you know, I didn't know I was going to do this when I finished my job with Women Forum International. I thought I was just going to do a transformational coach, write some more books, and then I found this training institute led by Thomas Hübel, who specializes in collective trauma healing, and it was just like, This is what I meant to do, because I kept traveling and kept witnessing this trauma and having this sense there's more I need to do, right? This typical story, I need more to do. And now I know that it's about spreading the knowledge around healing and how trauma can be healed, and how actually in the process hope is created. And once we have hope, we have fertile ground again, right? Yeah, thank you for that question.
Can I just quickly add something to this question, because I think contradictory to your answer, I've met so many people who were hopeless because my work was very different. You know, after Art of Hope, again, I was fortunate to be able to work in the sort of healing space, right, in collaboration with local mental health professionals in the field. But, you know, so many times, you know, when you're interviewing people who just left bombardment, when you're interviewing people who just left, you know, their burned village. I remember one of the most horrific, you know, trips and experiences that I've had was in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, covering the Rohingya refugee crisis. And to this day, these refugees are living in the same exact circumstances that they fled to after, you know, having their villages burned and their husbands and fathers and brothers killed and torched and raped, and, you know, the most brutal of experiences. And so I've seen so much of that. I've seen so much hopelessness and trauma and despair and later apathy that I think I remain angry, you know, in a sense that we fail to continuously think about the plight of refugees, okay? Nobody leaves their country. I mean, I'm sure we've heard this sentence a million times. I mean, nobody leaves their country or home unless, you know, they have to, obviously, okay? So they got to point B, that those invisible wounds of escape and trauma stay with these folks. And fundamentally, there's no difference between myself and, you know, a woman who was forced to flee her home, except that I just happened to be born in a different community, right? But so I say this with one ask, and that is, for us to not forget, for us to continuously think that these invisible wounds, that this hopelessness that folks endure, some extreme, some less extreme, continues to exist. And unless they're exposed to organizations like yours, or aid workers like yours, or support, tangible support, it doesn't go away. And that's why I think mental health is so important when it comes to the humanitarian space and the refugee support space, because it exists. And unless we continuously think about it and support that, it's not going anywhere.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. It's another question for Tara. You spoke very powerfully about shifting narratives and about moving away from cliches and the kinds of stories we might expect to consume and even become a little numb to, particularly in sort of humanitarian crises. The Ukraine crisis seems to have been covered, at least by the Western media, in quite a different way, which has, given rise to a lot of sort of negative commentary. There is certainly sort of the greater degree of empathy, I think, that's felt perhaps is quite shocking to some people. There are perhaps undertones or even overtones of sort of racism and so on. But do you think at the same time that might bode well for other humanitarian crises in the world and the connectivity that perhaps Western audiences feel to those? Because if there is generation of a little bit more empathy and connectivity and less of that sort of otherness, the stuff that we might have become numb to for certain areas of the world and certain assumptions we might be making, do you think that that can help shift the narrative for other crises that are just beyond awful, beyond our ability to sort of fathom the level of suffering? Do you think that this change is positive in some ways?
Yes, no, I understand what your question is, and I appreciate that. But my truthful and honest answer to that is, what a shame, right? What a shame that we have to be put in this circumstance to then therefore care about other people that we didn't care about before. Shame's on us, because there's no difference, right? In August, when Taliban took over of Afghanistan, we all, were supportive of Afghan women and girls and children, and oh my God. I wonder how many of us knew that yesterday was the first day, March 23rd, that Afghan girls were told that they can go back to school. They went, but they were sent back home, right? Some of us care, some of us may care, but we tend to forget, and it's okay. We shouldn't feel guilty of not constantly, putting the global crises, on the forefront of our daily lives. We shouldn't feel guilty about that. But the point, to answer your question, I don't think a humanitarian crisis in Europe should make the world care about ongoing humanitarian crises elsewhere. But you know what? If it's going to open the eyes of so many people whose eyes were closed before, let it be. I hope they learn, and I hope they realize that there's no difference. Like I said, there's no difference between that child who's fleeing Ukraine than a child who fled Syria or Afghanistan. There is really no difference. And coming back to the question earlier, is the more we support and empower the displaced and those folks who are coming to our homes, based on experience and from what I've seen in host communities, the more we're allowing a cohesive and inclusive society to thrive. Because the more we marginalize these people who are fleeing war, persecution, and utmost tragic circumstances, the more we're creating hatred and differences and conflict. And so, if this is what it takes, it's very sad, but I hope the world is learning.
Right. Rosie, do we still have time for?
Yeah, we have one more.
Okay.
It's a question to both of you, but Tara, I'm a fellow Iranian, so really feel privileged to be here and look forward to reading your book. to my two daughters, in fact. But I just want to know now, both of you written these two books, telling a lot of stories. One, what is your ambition with the books? I think you've kind of tried to tell us about the storytelling. But are you hoping that people, by being more informed, I think it's human nature that we want to take action and feel like we're doing something with this information, right? I can't tell you how many books I've read about life in Iran, and I've got my own story. Lots of books about empowering women. But you know, you always feel like, okay, I'm so informed, I've got so much of this information and stories, but still, you know, I'm not able to make the changes that I want to make. And so would love to hear your perspective on that, and then just what your sort of future plans are. I appreciate you've just launched your book, so there's a lot to be done with that. So I haven't thought about the next stage. But yeah, would be interested to know what you're thinking next.
Yeah, so my hope is really, I guess, what you're describing, that we often don't allow ourselves to really think and feel what we want to do, and then go ahead and actually do it, right? So we end up, we have this sense there's more that I could do, and I've read all these books and there's more that I could do, but I kind of never really do it. And I tried to create my book, really, it's very practical, short chapters and kind of action points at the end, and summaries to really help you go from inspiration, right? The kind of book guides you from inspiration to defining your purpose, so finding meaning, owning your power, and then transforming your world. So action is key. So you know, we can learn and we can read and we can absorb loads of information, but if we don't put if we don't move head to heart to hand, right? If we don't actually take action, then yeah, nothing is going to change, right? And so it's really, and what I always say, when you're inspired, right? When you hear something that inspires you, it gives you goosebumps, it's touching you, it's telling you something, it's like a signal. And so don't just say, oh, I'm really inspired, oh, that was really inspiring, and then you move on. Say, no, okay, stop. That was really inspiring. And what's the one thing you're going to do now as a result of that inspiration? So, and that's what I'm trying, one of the many things that I'm trying to do with my book, really give you the power. You have, the power is in you. You know, if you really want to change something, go and change it. It's not going to be easy, but you can do it. And it starts with the first action. Yeah, so that's me, yeah.
And actually, that was a point that I wanted to raise about your transformational work as a transformational coach, and finding the power that instead of empower, I mean, woman empowerment, you know, I myself often say women don't need to be empowered. You know, they have power. Right. They just have to recognize it, and then what's next, right? And
exactly, right, exactly. So in terms of what I'm doing now, or like what the next step is, so I've developed a Step Into Your Power program that I'm running for women in the UK, in Europe, and which kind of builds on some of the practical points there. And it's kind of like an accompaniment, and it's also mirroring the work that I did in countries affected by conflict, in that it brings women together. Because what I saw through the work of Women for Women International is that as you witness another woman's rising, she gives you wings. Right, so there's this ripple effect. You know you're not alone, and you inspire each other, and transformation happens so quickly. So I'm working with 12 women at the moment, and they're on week 10 of a 12-week program, and it's phenomenal. You know, really like, whew. So yeah. Thank you, Tara, for that question.
No, of course. I'm going to share one anecdote and one quote to hopefully answer your question. I'm not sure how many of you have read or heard of this little story. You know, there was a beach full of starfish. You know, and you know there was this little girl who saw this. You know, all these starfish were about to die because they were out of the water, and then she would one by one pick these starfish and threw them back in the water. And then, you know, as she was doing this, this guy walked by and is like, this girl's crazy. This little girl is out of her mind. There are hundreds of these starfish on the shore. I mean, she's not going to make a difference. And she went up to the little girl and said, do you see what's around you? What are you doing? It's not going to make any difference. And as she was picking up another starfish, she said, it is to this one. And she threw the fish back in the water. So it is making a difference for that one person that you had an impact on, whatever that impact was, whether it was a conversation, whether it was just the empathy that you developed in your heart toward that cause, toward that mission, toward that notion. And we talked about this earlier, and this is the quote that I want to share from an African-American athlete, Arthur Ashe. Some of you may know of him. He said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I truly believe in that, because, none of us can make the world go upside down, or none of us, I think, can stop the crises or the huge issues that we see so prevalent and continuously existing in our world, no matter what country we live in. But we can start where we are, use what we have, and do what we can. And I think one of the most rewarding things that I saw, since my book came out in June, Mitt Romney, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Mitt Romney, but he's, an incredibly conservative Republican senator in the United States, very, very influential when it comes to U.S. foreign policy from a, very conservative viewpoint. He wrote to me and he said, Tara, I look forward to reading your book about Iran and learning more about the Iranian people. And for me, as someone who has worked in Washington, who worked within the policy space, I understand the impact that people's stories can have on policymakers, okay? And the more U.S., this is pertaining to my book and the issue of Iran, I believe that the more the world, especially policymakers, know of the people of this country, rather than the rogue government, perhaps there can be more opportunities given to the people. I don't know how, but it's important that these powerful people everywhere around the world, as well as the societies of those countries, know more about this country than the government that dominates the headlines. And so that's, I suppose, one of the goals with the book. I didn't write this with any agenda. I have to say there were so many other things that I could do. This is the most challenging thing that I've probably done in my entire career, and it was a passion project. And I hope that also the Iranian American community, the Iranian diaspora in the UK, I guess now that I'm living here, take advantage of this book in order to introduce these alternative narratives that exist on our homeland, beyond the government.
Amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tara. Thank you, Brita, for such a powerful conversation. And I'm sure that everyone else here took away from it as much as I did. It was really, really wonderful. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As I mentioned, both Tara and Brita's books are at the back of the room, and they will be signing them. So please join us back there and grab a drink and continue the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
So don't go anywhere. We're going to sign